Jake Murphy sat in the back corner of the Galactic Academy's main cafeteria, trying to figure out which of the floating purple things on his tray was supposed to be food. The smell reminded him of his grandmother's attic mixed with burnt rubber. Around him, hundreds of alien students chattered in dozens of different languages, their voices creating a constant buzz that made his ears ring. 3 months into his exchange program, Jake still felt like an outsider. Earth had only joined the Galactic Educational Consortium 2 years ago, and he was one of the first human students to attend the academy. Most days he ate alone, while other species stuck to their own groups. Today was different. A crystalline being approached his table, her body catching the artificial light and throwing rainbow patterns across the walls. Jake recognized her from his comparative planetary biology class. Her name was Zixara, and she came from a high-gravity world called Vex Prime. "Human Jake," she said, her voice sounding like wind chimes in a breeze. "May I join your eating session?" Jake looked up, surprised. "Sure, go ahead." He gestured to the empty chair across from him. Zixara settled into the seat, her crystal body making small clinking sounds. "I have heard interesting rumors about your homeworld," she said. "Oh yeah? What kind of rumors?" "That Earth is classified as a Class 12 Deathworld by the Galactic Survey Council." Jake nearly choked on his drink. "A what world?" "Deathworld. Planets. Where the environment actively tries to eliminate life. Very few species evolve on such worlds." Her crystalline face somehow managed to look curious. "Is this true?" Jake thought about it for a moment. Back home in Montana, he had never considered Earth particularly dangerous. "I guess it depends on what you mean by dangerous." 2 more aliens approached the table. One was Polthen, an aquatic creature who wore a breathing apparatus filled with blue liquid. The other was Kritok, a large insectoid being with 4 arms and compound eyes. Both were from Jake's biology class. "We could not help but overhear." Kritok clicked, his mandibles moving rapidly. "My species has conquered 17 worlds, yet none were classified above Class 8. What makes Earth so deadly?" Jake looked around the table at the 3 aliens staring at him with obvious interest. He had never thought of himself as coming from anywhere special. Earth was just home. "Well," he began slowly, "I suppose we do have some challenging weather." "Weather?" Polthen's gills fluttered nervously. "On Serenity, weather means gentle rain and pleasant breezes." "Yeah, our weather can be a bit more intense than that." Jake tried to think of a good example. "Like where I grew up in Montana, winter temperatures can drop to 40 degrees below zero." The 3 aliens exchanged glances. Zixara spoke first. "Below zero? That seems impossible. Water becomes solid at 0 degrees. "Exactly, everything freezes. The air hurts to breathe. If you go outside without proper clothing, you can die in minutes." Jake took another bite of the mysterious purple food. "But that's just winter. Summer brings different problems." "Such as?" Kritok leaned forward, his compound eyes reflecting the cafeteria lights. "Forest fires, mainly. Last summer, a fire burned through 3 million acres near my hometown. The smoke was so thick you couldn't see the sun for weeks. Temperatures reached over 100 degrees Fahrenheit and the air was toxic to breathe." Polthen's breathing apparatus bubbled rapidly. "Your people evacuate during such disasters, yes?" Jake shook his head. "Some do, but many stay to fight the fires. My older brother spent 2 months working 18-hour shifts battling blazes. He was only 19 at the time." 19? Zixara's crystals dimmed with what Jake had learned was her species' version of shock. "On Vex Prime, individuals that young are not permitted near dangerous situations. On Earth, we need everyone who can help. The fires don't wait for you to get older." Jake paused, remembering the orange glow on the horizon that had lasted for days. Besides, by 19, most humans have already survived plenty of dangerous situations. Kritok's mandibles clicked skeptically. What sort of dangers could a young human face? Jake thought back to his childhood. Where should he even start? "Well, when I was 8, I got caught in a blizzard while helping my father check on our cattle. We were trapped in our truck for 6 hours while snow piled up around us. The temperature was 30 below and the wind was so strong it shook the truck. This happened when you were only 8 years old? Polthen asked, his voice rising an octave. Yeah, but that wasn't the scary part. The scary part was when we ran out of fuel for the heater. My dad made me do jumping jacks in the truck to keep my blood moving while he tried to dig us out. The 3 aliens sat in stunned silence. Finally, Zixara spoke. And your parents permitted you to accompany them into such danger? It wasn't supposed to be dangerous. The weather report said light snow. But on Earth, weather reports are more like suggestions than facts. Nature does whatever it wants. Jake shrugged. Besides, ranch work doesn't stop for bad weather. Animals still need food and water no matter what's happening outside. More students had begun gathering around their table, drawn by the conversation. Jake noticed several species he didn't recognize, all listening intently. What other dangers exist on your world? Asked a new voice. Jake turned to see a tall, thin being with silver skin and large black eyes. This was Lyra, an energy-based life form who rarely spoke in class. Jake considered the question. Well, there are the earthquakes. Hurricanes, tornadoes, flash floods, volcanic eruptions, avalanches, mudslides, and tsunamis. Oh, and the wildlife can be pretty challenging too. The gathered aliens made various sounds of disbelief. Polthen's gills were fluttering so rapidly that his breathing apparatus was fogging up. Perhaps, Zixara said carefully, you could tell us about one of these tornadoes? Jake looked around at the crowd of alien faces, all focused on him with rapt attention. For the first time since arriving at the academy, he felt like he had something interesting to contribute. Sure, he said, settling back in his chair. Let me tell you about the time I was 12, and 3 tornadoes hit my town in one afternoon. Jake took a sip of his drink and looked around at the circle of alien faces watching him. The cafeteria had grown quieter as more students stopped their conversations to listen. He had never been the center of attention like this before. So I was 12 years old, Jake began, and it was a Tuesday afternoon in May. I was walking home from school with my friend Danny when the sky started looking weird. Weird how? Polthen asked, his gills fluttering with nervous energy. The clouds were this sickly green color, and they were moving in circles. The air felt heavy and electric, like right before lightning strikes. All the birds had disappeared, which is never a good sign. Kritak's compound eyes reflected the light as he leaned closer. Your species can predict these tornado events by observing animal behavior? Sometimes. Animals can sense changes in air, pressure, and electrical fields better than we can. When every bird, dog, and cat in town suddenly goes quiet or starts acting strange, you know something bad is coming. Jake paused, remembering that day. The memory was still clear after 7 years. Danny and I were about 6 blocks from home when the tornado sirens started wailing. Have you ever heard a tornado siren? The aliens shook their heads. It's this loud rising and falling sound that makes your bones vibrate. It means you have maybe 15 minutes to find shelter before a spinning column of wind tears through. Your town at 200 miles per hour. Zixara's crystals dimmed again. 200 miles per hour, that seems impossibly fast. Fast enough to pick up cars and throw them like toys. Fast enough to drive pieces of straw through tree trunks like spears. Jake gestured with his hands, trying to help them visualize the power. The tornado that hit us that day was rated an F3, which means winds between 158 and 206 miles per hour. You have a rating system for these disasters? Lyra asked, her energy form flickering with curiosity. The Fujita scale goes from F0 to F5. An F5 can level entire neighborhoods and throw school buses half a mile. Jake shook his head. But an F3 is still nothing to mess with. More students had gathered around their table. Jake counted at least 15 different species now listening to his story. He felt a mix of pride and embarrassment at the attention. So, Danny and I started running toward my house, but we could see the tornado forming in the distance. It looked like a gray rope hanging from the clouds, getting thicker and darker as it touched the ground. You could hear it from miles away like a freight train mixed with a jet engine. Did you reach safety in time? Asked a new voice. Jake turned to see a small, furry creature with 6 legs and large purple eyes. Not quite. We were still 4 blocks away when we saw debris flying through the air above us. Pieces of roofing, tree branches, things I couldn't identify. That's when we knew we weren't going to make it home. Jake remembered the fear that had gripped him then, the way his 12-year-old heart had hammered against his ribs. There was a small grocery store nearby, so we ran inside. The owner, Mrs. Peterson, took one look at us and pointed toward the back of the store. "Basement now," she said. "Your buildings have underground sections?" Kritok asked. "Most of them. Yeah. Basements and storm cellars are pretty common in tornado country." Mrs. Peterson had converted hers into a proper tornado shelter with reinforced walls and emergency supplies. Jake took another sip of his drink, gathering his thoughts. The aliens waited patiently, hanging on every word. There were already 8 other people in that basement when Danny and I got down there. Mrs. Peterson had a battery-powered radio, and we listened to the weather reports. That's when we learned it wasn't just one tornado. There were 3 of them, all heading straight for our town. Pol then made a choking sound through his breathing apparatus. 3 tornadoes simultaneously? Supercells can spawn multiple tornadoes. It's rare, but it happens. The first one passed about 2 blocks north of us. We could hear it ripping buildings apart, and the whole basement shook like an earthquake. Mrs. Peterson made us all sit in the center of the room, away from the walls, and cover our heads with our arms. "How long did this last?" Zixara asked. "The first tornado took about 10 minutes to pass. But then the radio said the second one was coming from the southwest. It was bigger than the first one, and it was headed right for downtown." Jake paused, remembering the sound of Mrs. Peterson praying quietly in the corner while the storm raged above them. "The second tornado hit us directly. I've never experienced anything like it. The noise was incredible, like the world was being torn in half. The building above us groaned and creaked, and we could hear glass breaking and metal twisting. Several aliens in the crowd made various sounds of distress. Jake noticed that some were unconsciously moving closer together, seeking comfort from his story. The worst part was the pressure change. Your ears pop, like when you're in an airplane, but much worse. Some of the younger kids in the basement started crying because it hurt so much, and the basement door kept trying to blow open, so 2 of the adults had to hold it shut. "Were you frightened?" Lyra asked softly. Jake considered the question. Terrified, but also excited in a weird way. There's something about surviving nature's power that makes you feel incredibly alive, like you're part of something bigger than yourself. "The third tornado had been the worst," Jake continued. "It stayed on the ground for almost 30 minutes, carving a path of destruction 3 miles long and half a mile wide. When they finally emerged from the basement, Jake's hometown looked like a war zone. But here's the thing," Jake said, looking around at his audience. "Within hours, people were already starting to rebuild. Neighbors were helping neighbors, strangers were pulling survivors from rubble, and kids like me were carrying water bottles to rescue workers. That's just what humans do." The cafeteria had fallen completely silent except for Jake's voice. The next evening, Jake found himself back in the cafeteria, with an even larger crowd gathered around his table. Word had spread throughout the academy about the human student who told incredible stories about his dangerous homeworld. Students, from species he had never seen before, sat listening with wide eyes and various expressions of fascination. Zixara had saved him a seat, and Pol then had brought his own breathing apparatus cleaner so he could listen without the distraction of fogged equipment. Kurtok had positioned himself where his forearms could gesture freely as he asked questions. "Human Jake," called out a new voice. Jake turned to see Professor Velmar, his comparative planetary biology teacher, approaching with a cup of steaming liquid. The elderly professor was from Bibliotheca, a world known for its vast libraries and scholarly pursuits. "Professor," Jake said, standing respectfully, "please sit. I heard about your tornado account yesterday and found it quite educational." The professor settled into a nearby chair, his long robes rustling. "I have been researching your homeworld's classification, and I must admit the data is remarkable." More students pressed closer to hear the conversation. Jake counted at least 30 different beings now gathered around their section of the cafeteria. "I was wondering," Professor Velmar continued, "if you might share another example of Earth's environmental challenges. Perhaps something different from atmospheric phenomena." Jake thought for a moment. Well, there was the time our ranch almost got wiped out by a wildfire. I was 15, and it was the driest summer on record. The crowd settled in expectantly. Jake had learned that his alien classmates loved details, so he started from the beginning. It had been 3 months without any real rain. The grass was brown and brittle, and the trees looked like they were dying. The fire danger was so high that the county banned all outdoor burning, smoking, and even camping. Your authorities can predict fire danger? Asked a slug-like creature Jake didn't recognize. Oh yeah, we have a whole system for it. They measure humidity, wind speed, temperature, and how dry the vegetation is. Then they assign a danger level from low to extreme. That summer we were at extreme for 6 straight weeks. Professor Velmar nodded approvingly. Fascinating adaptation. Your species has learned to monitor multiple environmental variables simultaneously. We had to, Jake continued. Fire is one of the biggest threats where I live. My family's ranch covers about 8,000 acres, and we run cattle and horses. If a fire gets started, it can spread faster than you can run. Polden's gills fluttered nervously. How fast do these fires move? Depends on the wind and terrain. In grassland with a strong breeze, a fire can move at 60 miles per hour. That's faster than most vehicles can drive on rough ground. Several aliens made sounds of disbelief. Kritok clicked his mandibles rapidly. Surely your people evacuate when such fires begin. Jake shook his head. Some do, but ranchers like my family usually stay to protect our animals and property. My dad, my brother Pete, and I spent 2 weeks fighting fires that summer. 2 weeks? Zixara's crystals pulsed with concern. You were exposed to this danger for 14 consecutive days? The fire started about 20 miles south of our ranch on a Tuesday morning. Lightning struck a dead tree during a brief thunderstorm. Within 4 hours, it had burned through 12,000 acres. Jake paused to take a drink, remembering the orange glow that had dominated the southern horizon. We could see the smoke from our kitchen window. Dad called the county fire department, but they were already stretched thin fighting 6 other fires. Your father contacted emergency services, Professor Velmar said. What was their response? They said they'd send help when they could, but we were low priority since no buildings were immediately threatened. They told us to prepare for evacuation, but suggested we start our own fire breaks if we had the equipment. Fire breaks? Asked the slug-like creature. Wide strips of cleared land with nothing to burn. You plow up the grass and vegetation to create a barrier the fire can't cross easily. Jake gestured with his hands. We had a tractor with a disc plow, so Dad sent Pete and me out to start cutting fire breaks around our buildings and pastures. The crowd listened intently as Jake described spending the next day plowing under the blazing sun while smoke filled the air. He and Pete had worked 12-hour shifts, trading off driving the tractor while the other walked behind, looking for mist, spots or places where the plow hadn't cut deep enough. On Thursday, the wind shifted and pushed the fire directly toward us. We could see flames jumping from treetop to treetop about 5 miles away. That's when Dad made the decision to send our livestock to my uncle's ranch 50 miles north. You evacuated your animals but remained yourself? Lyra asked, her energy form flickering rapidly. Someone had to stay to protect the buildings and fight spot fires. Dad had been through this before, and he taught Pete and me what to do. Jake's voice grew more serious. The fire reached our outer fence line on Friday afternoon. He described the terrifying experience of watching walls of flame 30 feet high advance across the landscape. The sound was like a continuous roar mixed with sharp cracking as trees exploded from the heat. The temperature rose to over 120 degrees Fahrenheit, and the air became almost too hot to breathe. We used our irrigation sprinklers to soak the buildings and create wet zones around them. Pete and I took turns on the roof with garden hoses, putting out ember fires as they started. Ember fires? Kurtok asked. Burning pieces of debris that the wind carries ahead of the main fire. They can land miles away and start new fires. We probably put out 50 small fires that day just from falling embers. Professor Velmar leaned forward. And your family succeeded in protecting your property? We saved the main buildings, but we lost about 2,000 acres of pasture and most of our fencing. The fire burned for 6 more days before rain finally put it out completely. Jake looked around at the stunned faces surrounding him. But here's the thing that always amazes people from other worlds. The day after the fire passed, neighbors started showing up with supplies, tools, and volunteer labor. People we barely knew brought food, water, and materials to start rebuilding our fences. Without being asked, the slug creature inquired. That's just what humans do. When disaster hits, we help each other. By the end of the month, we had more help than we knew what to do with. Families drove hundreds of miles just to spend their weekends helping us rebuild. The cafeteria had grown quiet except for the soft sounds of alien breathing and the occasional clink of Zixara's crystals. Professor Velmar broke the silence. Remarkable. Your species treats survival as a community effort rather than individual competition. Jake shrugged. It has to be. Earth throws too much at us for anyone to survive alone. By the third week of Jake's storytelling sessions, the cafeteria had to rearrange tables to accommodate the growing crowd. Students from every corner of the galaxy now gathered each evening to hear tales from the humans' Deathworld. Some brought recording devices, others took notes, and a few had started bringing friends from other dormitories. Jake sat at what had become known as the human table, with his original group of listeners. Zixara, Polthan, and Kritok had become something like unofficial moderators, helping to organize questions from the crowd and making sure everyone could hear. Tonight felt different, though. Jake noticed several academy instructors scattered throughout the audience, trying to look casual while obviously listening to every word. Professor Velmar sat at his usual spot, but Jake also spotted Commander Lisa Brooks, the human military liaison officer, standing near the back wall. "Human Jake," called out a voice from the crowd. Jake turned to see a tall, thin being with silver skin and multiple arms. "I am Kel Nara from the engineering department. I have heard your stories of atmospheric and thermal disasters. But what about geological events? Does your world's surface also attack its inhabitants?" Jake almost laughed at the way the question was phrased, but he caught himself. These beings were genuinely trying to understand how humans had survived long enough to develop civilization. "Oh yeah, the ground tries to kill us too," Jake said with a slight grin. "Let me tell you about the earthquake that hit when I was 16. The crowd settled in expectantly. Jake had learned to pace his stories, building suspense and providing enough detail to help his alien audience visualize Earth's dangers. "I was working a summer job at a camp for kids in the mountains of California. It was my first time that far from Montana, and I thought I was going to have a nice, quiet summer teaching horseback riding and hiking." California, Professor Velmar noted, is located along several major tectonic plate boundaries, if I recall correctly. Exactly. The whole state sits on top of dozens of fault lines where chunks of the Earth's crust grind against each other. Most of the time you can't feel it, but sometimes the pressure builds up and then releases all at once. Jake paused to take a sip of water. It was a Tuesday morning about 6:30. I was in the dining hall helping prepare breakfast for 60 kids when the ground started moving. "Moving how?" asked Polthan, his gills already beginning to flutter with nervousness. At first it felt like a big truck was driving past the building, just a gentle rumbling and swaying. But then it got stronger. The floor started rolling like waves on water, and all the dishes began sliding off the tables. Several aliens made concerned noises. A crystalline being similar to Zixara asked, "How long did this motion continue?" The main quake lasted about 45 seconds, which doesn't sound like much until you're living through it. When the ground under your feet is moving like liquid, 45 seconds feels like an hour. Jake described how the building had swayed back and forth, creaking and groaning as its wooden frame flexed. Light fixtures swung wildly overhead, and several windows cracked from the stress. In the kitchen, pots and pans crashed to the floor, and the big industrial refrigerator walked several feet across the room. But the scary part wasn't the earthquake itself, Jake continued. It was what came after. We had 60 kids between the ages of 8 and 15, and most of them had never experienced an earthquake before. Half of them were screaming, and the other half were frozen with terror. Commander Brooks pushed through the crowd and took a seat at a nearby table. Jake noticed her listening intently, occasionally nodding at parts of his story. "What did you do?" asked Kritok, his compound eyes reflecting the cafeteria lights. First thing was to get everyone outside in case there were aftershocks. The camp director, Mr. Rodriguez, started organizing the evacuation while I and the other counselors tried to calm down the kids. But we had a problem. Jake paused for effect, looking around at the rapt faces surrounding him. 3 of the younger kids had been in the bathroom when the earthquake hit, and the door had jammed shut. We could hear them crying inside, but we couldn't get the door open. The building's frame had shifted just enough to warp the doorway. The aliens leaned forward, clearly invested in the outcome of Jake's story. Mr. Rodriguez wanted to wait for professional rescue workers, but the nearest fire department was 40 miles away, and they were dealing with their own earthquake damage. Meanwhile, we could hear aftershocks starting, and the building was making new creaking sounds. "So you attempted the rescue yourself?" Professor Velmar asked. I grabbed a fire axe from the emergency kit and started chopping through the wall next to the door. The other counselors thought I was crazy, but those kids were getting more panicked by the minute, and I was worried the next aftershock might make things worse. Jake described hacking through drywall and wooden studs while aftershocks continued to rattle the building. Each tremor made everyone nervous, but he kept working, driven by the sound of frightened children on the other side of the wall. It took about 20 minutes to cut a hole big enough for the kids to crawl through. They were scared and crying, but none of them were hurt. We got them outside just before a big aftershock hit that probably would have made the rescue much more difficult. The crowd murmured with relief, but Jake wasn't finished with his story. That's when we discovered our real problems were just beginning. The earthquake had damaged the road leading down from the mountain. There were rock slides blocking the path in 3 places, and one section of the road had completely collapsed. "You were trapped?" Zixara asked, her crystals dimming with concern. "For 4 days. We had 60 scared kids, limited food supplies, and no way to get help up the mountain. The radio said it might be a week before repair crews could clear the road." Jake went on to describe how the camp staff had organized the children into work groups, assigning tasks to keep everyone busy and their minds off the situation. Some kids helped with cooking, others with cleaning, and the older ones assisted with basic repairs to the damaged buildings. But the most important thing was keeping morale up. We turned it into an adventure instead of a disaster. We told stories around the campfire, played games, and made sure the kids felt safe and cared. Commander Brooks spoke up from her table. "How did you manage food rationing with that many children?" "We stretched everything we could and supplemented with edible plants from the forest. I had learned some basic wilderness survival skills back home, so I taught the older kids how to identify safe berries and roots. We also set up a fishing operation at the lake. The aliens looked amazed that humans would turn a disaster into a learning experience. On the 4th day, we heard helicopters. The National Guard had finally organized an airlift to evacuate the camp. But here's the thing that surprised the rescue workers," Jake said with a smile. "When they landed, they found 60 kids who were disappointed their adventure was ending. Half of them asked if they could come back next summer." The cafeteria erupted with various alien sounds of amazement and approval. Commander Brooks was nodding and smiling, clearly proud of the human response Jake had described. Professor Velmar raised his hand for quiet. "This adaptability and positive attitude in crisis situations appears to be a common human trait. How do you explain this?" Jake thought for a moment. "I think it's because Earth never gives us a choice. You either learn to adapt and help each other, or you don't survive. It becomes so natural that kids can do it without even thinking about it." A month had passed since Jake's first storytelling session, and the evening gatherings had become an official academy event. The administration had moved them to the main auditorium to accommodate the hundreds of students who now attended regularly. Jake sat on a small stage, still feeling awkward about being the center of so much attention. Tonight was different because Academy Director Thanecore had announced that representatives from the Galactic Council would be attending. Jake spotted several beings he didn't recognize wearing formal diplomatic robes scattered throughout the audience. Commander Brooks sat in the front row with Professor Velmar and other senior staff. "Human Jake," Director Thanecore said, his voice carrying clearly through the auditorium's sound system. "Before you begin tonight's account, I want to share something with our audience. Since you started these sessions, applications to Earth's exchange program have increased by 400%. Students across the galaxy want to learn from humans. The auditorium filled with various sounds of approval from dozens of different species. Jake felt his face grow warm with embarrassment and pride. Furthermore, the director continued, several council worlds have requested human advisors for their emergency response programs. It seems your species' approach to disaster management is quite valuable. Jake looked out at the sea of alien faces, all watching him expectantly. Zixara, Polthan, and Kritok sat in their usual spots near the front, giving him encouraging gestures. Tonight, Jake said, his voice shaking slightly at first, I want to tell you about something that happened when I was 17. It's about the most dangerous situation I've ever been in, and it shows why humans never give up on each other. The auditorium fell silent except for the soft hum of life support systems. It was late March, and I was on a camping trip with my younger sister Katie and my cousin Ben. We'd gone up into the mountains for spring break, planning to spend a week hiking and fishing. Jake paused, organizing his thoughts. This story was harder to tell than the others because it was more personal. The weather report said we might get some light snow, but nothing serious. What they didn't predict was a late-season blizzard that would dump 4 feet of snow in 12 hours. Several aliens made concerned noises. By now, Jake's audience had learned that unpredictable weather on Earth usually meant serious trouble. We were about 15 miles from the nearest road when the storm hit. The temperature dropped from 40 degrees to 10 below zero in about 3 hours. The wind was so strong it knocked down trees, and the snow was falling so thick we couldn't see 10 feet in any direction. 15 miles from assistance, noted one of the council representatives, a tall being with blue skin and 4 eyes. What were your survival options? We had a decent tent and sleeping bags rated for cold weather, plus about 3 days' worth of food. The problem was finding a safe place to wait out the storm. Jake described how they had struggled through knee-deep snow, looking for shelter while the wind grew stronger and the temperature continued to drop. Katie, who was only 14, had started showing signs of hypothermia despite her winter gear. We found a small cave in some rocks, big enough for the 3 of us but not much more. It wasn't ideal, but it was out of the wind and snow. Hypothermia, Professor Velmar interjected for the benefit of the alien audience, occurs when the human body's core temperature drops below safe levels. It can be fatal within hours. Exactly. Katie was shivering uncontrollably and her speech was getting slurred. I knew we were in serious trouble. Jake went on to describe setting up their emergency shelter in the cave, using their tent as extra insulation and rationing their food carefully. But the real crisis came on the second day when Katie's condition worsened. She stopped shivering, which is actually a bad sign. It means her body was starting to shut down. Ben and I took turns sharing our body heat with her, but she was getting weaker by the hour. The auditorium was completely silent now. Even the usual background chatter had stopped. On the third day, the storm finally broke, but we were buried under 4 feet of snow. I tried to dig us out, but every time I made progress, more snow would fall into the hole. Meanwhile, Katie was barely conscious. What did you do? Asked Zixara, her crystals pulsing with anxiety. I made a decision that probably saved her life but could have killed me. I left Ben with Katie and started hiking toward the road to get help. Several aliens gasped or made their species equivalent sounds of shock. Commander Brooks leaned forward in her seat, clearly invested in the story. I knew the general direction, but in deep snow with no landmarks visible, it was basically a guess. The temperature was still 15 below, and I was already tired from 3 days of stress and limited food. Jake described the grueling 8-hour trek through snow that sometimes came up to his chest. He had to stop frequently to rest and warm his hands and feet, knowing that frostbite could cost him fingers or toes. Several times he considered turning back, but the thought of Katie dying in that cave kept him moving. I was about ready to collapse when I saw tire tracks on what I hoped was the main road. A few minutes later, I heard a snowplow coming. The relief in the auditorium was almost physical as aliens relaxed in their seats. The plow driver was a guy named Carl, who'd been working search and rescue for 20 years. He immediately called for a helicopter and medical team, then drove me back toward the mountains in his truck. Jake went on to explain how the rescue helicopter had used his GPS coordinates to find the cave. Katie was airlifted to a hospital while Ben and Jake were treated for mild frostbite and exhaustion. Katie spent 2 days in the hospital, but she made a complete recovery. The doctors said if I'd waited another few hours to get help, she probably wouldn't have made it. Commander Brooks stood up and began clapping. Within seconds, the entire auditorium erupted in applause, with hundreds of aliens showing approval in their various cultural ways. When the noise died down, Director Thanacor approached the stage. Human Jake, this final story perfectly demonstrates why the Galactic Council has decided to establish the Human Resilience Institute here at the Academy. Jake looked confused. The what? A new program where humans will teach emergency response, disaster survival, and crisis leadership to students from across the galaxy. We want every species to learn from humanity's approach to impossible situations. The director turned to address the full audience. Humans don't just survive their death world, they thrive because of it. They've learned that no challenge is too great when people work together and never give up on each other. As Jake looked out at hundreds of alien faces showing respect and admiration, he realized something important had changed. These beings no longer saw humans as curiosities from a dangerous world. They saw them as teachers who had learned valuable lessons about courage, cooperation, and hope. The universe is full of dangers, Director Thanacor concluded. But thanks to humans like Jake, we're all better prepared to face them together. The auditorium erupted in applause once more, and Jake smiled, thinking about how proud his family back on Earth would be to know that their stories of survival had inspired beings from across the galaxy. Earth's toughest student had become something he never expected, a bridge between worlds, showing the universe that even the most impossible challenges could be overcome with the right attitude and the help of friends. As the evening ended and aliens filed out discussing what they'd learned, Jake sat with his original group of listeners. They weren't just classmates anymore. They were friends who understood that strength came not from avoiding danger, but from facing it together. Human from the death world had found his place among the stars.